for you.
Probably ruined everything.
So we're starting with the red one, right? We're doing 9 or 2?
I think it was two that we chose was better, right?
Pretty ending.
Holds up on like another minute.
Totally.
But there is
We can
two
wait.
different area juries going on, so there
Oh.
may be a lot of shifts.
That's all right.
Woodwinds and Brasses are going through five.
Ah.
So usually it's
Poor thing.
larger class, but.
Great. Give me 3 seconds.
All right, I guess we'll start. Hello, hello. Hello, can you hear me? Great. Hi. All right, I am not Dr. Gerard. He's in Woodwind jury, so he asked me to make an introduction to my ensemble. Two of the gentlemen here in this group are my musical mentor from Yale. But you will soon hear how amazing they are as a group, as individual musicians. But most importantly, you're looking at the instruments that are kind of ancestral to what you guys actually do. So it's a great chance for you to hear all these instruments, and they are gracious enough to give their time before their performance tonight to introduce their instruments and so on, so on, so on. So therefore, please be free of phone for an hour. We can do this. And make sure to come back at 7:30 tonight to hear the whole entire program. And then tomorrow morning, strings and piano will be here in Legacy. Don't look at me like that. We will all show up here at 10 o'clock. And then woodwinds with bassoon will be in 1714, and guitars are in 1716, or it's the other way around. And lastly, brass will be in studio theater with trombone. So without further ado, here, are you going to speak? Or here's, okay, here's Quicksilver Ensemble.
Quicksilver, we come together from all across the country to play this music that we love so much, and it's music that I bet you probably haven't heard before. This is this music of sort of before Bach, before Handel, the music of the 17th century, when people are just starting to discover what these instruments can do so spectacularly. And one of the things about the composers at the time is they're really interested in exploring instrumental music that's not necessarily influenced by text, it's not necessarily in a dance form. It actually has no, as you just heard, it has no sort of formal overall structure. It tends to be kind of a conversation between instruments, and someone suggests an idea and then we go with that, and then someone else suggests another idea, we go with that instead. So it's wonderful for us because it's a real sharing of ideas and voices as we play together. One thing that's wonderful about this music is that there's enormous scope for improvisation for all of us. So every time we play these pieces, it'll be just a little bit different, especially when we come to these big cadential moments when some kind of ornamentation happens, and then we just, something happens, which is really, really nice. So what we'll be playing tonight, I hope you can hear it, is music of various composers from the 17th century, starting with some of the earliest music we have from the 1620s, that is earliest music written for these specific instruments, and then going on through to the 1680s. And it's kind of story about how Italy especially invents this new idea called the sonata, which is not something that you guys know from music history classes. It's not, there's no exposition, development, recapitulation, there's none of that. It's just, at this point, a sonata just means something to be sounded, something that instruments play, as opposed to a cantata, which is something that's sung. So at the time, it's a little bit like abstract art, like anything can happen within it. So composers were really free to let their imaginations run wild. And one of the things about the 17th century in particular is that they really loved the wildness of these imaginations, that they loved having music that surprised you, that delighted you, that made you want to dance, that made you want to cry, that spoke to you. So one of the reasons why we're called Quicksilver is because that was the element, it's the element of mercury, and in alchemy, which was kind of the thing before chemistry, the sort of pre-science of the 17th century, Quicksilver is the element that transforms everything. So it's also the element of rapid change and transformation. So it seemed like a very appropriate name for this group that's devoted to this music. So shall we play a little bit of that Castello just to... So one thing about what we're up to, because this music is very unfamiliar, we thought it might be interesting to give you the kind of vanilla version of parts of one of these sonatas, just to hear what it sounds like just on the page. And then we'll play it with the kind of inflections and freedom that they really cherished at the time. So this is the straight version. just what the notes say on the page. This is a sonata by a guy named Dario Castello, who was writing right around the time of Monteverdi in Venice around 1620. He probably knew Monteverdi, he probably played with Monteverdi. And what Monteverdi talks about when he talks about his madrigals is that he says you can have a huge amount of freedom and inflection depending on the affect, on the emotion that you want to convey, on the speech of the music itself. So even though we don't have words in this, we're finding a way to make this a effective speech. So it might go like this. Could go like that. I'm just curious, what do you hear in those differences? I'm just like from total first reactions to all that. Any responses? Just raise your hand. Stunned silence. Yeah. What's that? Trills. Yeah. We're adding a lot more ornamentation the second time. We know they did that. We know they also don't write it down necessarily. So one thing that we're lucky is that in the early 17th century, there was kind of a market for, probably for amateurs who wanted to figure out how to do this. So they would publish like essentially fake books that were tables of ornaments of like how to get from here to there, how to fill in a fourth, how to fill in a fifth, and just all these different patterns, different possibilities. So, as with any kind of improvisation, we're working in a language, so the trick is just to find the vocabulary of that language so that we can speak it as effectively as possible. I mean, the same thing happens for all of you when you're trying to play Mozart and really invest yourself in Mozart style, or Shostakovich, or Berio, whatever. You know, each of these composers has a very specific speech that they know, and and that's the trick, I think, for all of us, is to find how to speak this music as fluently as possible. So, other thoughts? Yeah.
There seems to be a lot more communication on the second time.
We have to keep our eyes on each other. Because, yeah, that's some of the real fun about it, is that once you open that door, you know, really anything could happen. So, yeah, have to keep your eyes on people.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question. When you're doing ornamentation, is that improvised?
Yeah. Yeah, that will not happen again. Or not like that, at least. Yeah. Yeah. One thing to notice, and we'll talk about all these instruments, but it might be Avi and Dan, if you just want to talk about the function of what you're up to with this, because I mean, we have melodies that we get to play, but actually Avi and Dan are doing something very different with what they're up to.
So, you might know in pop music, there's the stuff, pop music or jazz, there's the stuff that's written down. You have a melody, and usually that's kind of it if you look at lead sheets, right? But there's usually some set of chords written in, and those chords are shorthand notation for what you're supposed to do. They don't tell you exactly which notes to play, right? If it says C major, it tells you which notes are fair game, but it doesn't say this C, that E, this G, or anything like that. And that's the version that we have. We have a 17th century lead sheet, which is called figured bass, and I figure you all have to take some version of figured bass in your theory class, right? Well, it might feel a little bit, I don't know, it feels perhaps a little theoretical, a little pedagogical to keep your voice leading correct. In the same way that if you learn a language, you have to remember your conjugations and your verbs and your grammar and all that, but it's all in the service of something much better, right? You learn how to speak a language so you can communicate, and you learn how to read the shorthand system of notation so you can actually play something nice. And what this system, it has several functions. The most basic version of it is it saves a lot of time. Instead of writing everything out, then you can just write very simply, all we really have is the bass line. Every once in a while we have a few figures. In the 17th century you actually don't get a lot of figures. By the time you get to Bach there are quite a few figures, but not always. I would say maybe about half of the cantatas of Bach have figures in them, the rest don't. But we have a bass line, which I play with my left hand and Dan plays with his right hand and thumb, basically. And so it's a very efficient way of doing it. There's one good quote from an early book from the first decade of the 17th century talking about why is it that they're writing figured bass now and how to do it. And it says if you really had fully written out parts to accompany everything, you'd have a bigger library than a lawyer. And so it actually is quite efficient. Just write the bass line and then let the player decide what to do. The other thing that's good about it is that it means that Dan and I can play off the same part. Dan also has a guitar down there, so Dan can play off the same part for both this theorbo and the guitar, or if I had a harp, or an organ, or the harpsichord, or anything that can play chords, we can just play off the same part, because it just gives us a bass line, we know what the implied harmonies are, and we make it up based on that. Finally, there's the real artistic reason for it, which is, as you see, they take a lot of freedom in what they do, both in terms of musical, but also in terms of expressive, whether they decide to be very loud or very quiet at any given point. And so not having it written down means that we can adjust what we do in order to match what it is that they do. Want to explain a little about that theorbo?
Oh, yeah, we could actually go around and talk about our, instruments. Yeah.
Is there a functional difference between lead sheet notation and figured bass?
What do you mean by functional?
So, like, could you use lead sheet notation for this song?
Easy, absolutely. It's just it's a different shorthand system of notation. So if I wanted to, I could write the whole thing C major, G minor, and the like. The only difference is that with lead sheets, the bass line itself is not specified. So with lead sheets, sure you can write like a G minor over B flat, and it tells you that it's a first inversion chord as opposed to root position. But it would be hard to write complicated bass lines with a lead sheet. That being said, you could easily have a bass line, and rather than writing the figures on top, you could write letter names on top of that. But functionally they're exactly the same. They just tell you what the harmony is at any given point.
In fact, they actually did that with a system of guitar notation that we call alphabetto, just the alphabet. And the guitar could either play from the bass line with the figures or no figures, or very common, at least in the early 17th century, I think in an attempt to appeal to amateur markets, guitars, there was just a system of chords that told you what to play. The weird thing about it, though, is they were kind of the most common chords. So letter A is actually a G major chord. Letter B is a C major chord. Letter C is a D major chord, but letter E is a D minor chord. So then there's letter L, So it's not really logical, but you just kind of learn it. And this would appear particularly in a lot of vocal music, kind of with the assumption that a singer might accompany themselves just playing the guitar. So there was both kind of a lead sheet and this basso continuo world happening simultaneously, at least for this instrument.
Other questions about the mysteries of the basso continuo? We'll talk a little bit about our instruments. Do you want to talk about them?
Sure. So this is probably the most familiar of all these instruments up here to you. It looks just like the violins that you play. There just are a few differences that take us back to, again, this music and the way we like to play it and the way they knew it to sound as they were composing it. So you see that, first of all, cosmetically, there's no chin rest. There's no official big shoulder rest. And I don't know if you even play with those in modern. Some people don't. Our strings are made out of gut. So open gut on the top and wound gut on the bottom. And this is true also of the lute and bass instruments as well. The neck is a little bit thicker, if you can see it, and set straight in rather than tilted back. And that's because the halls were just kind of like this one. This is a perfect hall for us. It's not too big, right? So we don't have to fill up a huge hall, so our instruments didn't have to be quite as loud as the modern instruments. And did you want to talk about I'll start the conversation.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be playing with the 17th century bow, which is about the length of my violin, and they talk about that in some of the treatises. You'll see that it has a curve that goes outward rather than concave. It's convex. And there's quite a lot of space in between the wood and the hair. This frog is a clip-in frog, so you can take it in and out. And in order to tighten it, since we don't have a screw on the end, we put little pieces of leather or string or paper or whatever we have, so that we can keep this tension, which works so well in the violins.
So these bows were in use till 1730s or so? Yeah. So they actually used short bows for a long time. And then around 1730, 1740, they came up with the long model. But you can see that even that, I mean, I don't have a modern bow, but a modern bow goes to like there. So the real estate on these is much less, which means you're much more involved with fine gestures. It's a lot more like, it's like doing calligraphy or signing a check. Or fencing. Yeah. It's that. Rather than modern playing, which tends to use a lot more of the arm. With this, it's a lot more local. It's like driving a little sports car instead of a big plush Cadillac. So actually the violin is obviously, the strings, the difference in setup is a lot, but really I think the bows do even more. So those of you who are string players, please think about just getting they're very decent, very cheap rope bows out on the market, and they really teach you. This is like the best possible teacher to have. It will really tell you what it wants to do. And it really reveals what the music wants to do then as well.
And we're happy to let you try ours if you'd like to, after this or after our concert tonight.
You guys want to go on to the mysteries of the plucked instruments?
Sure. All right, well this is probably the instrument you're most familiar with. No? All right. This is called the theorbo, and it was a type of lute, just like the violin is a type of viola. It was invented about 1580 and used for about 200 years. What distinguishes a theorbo from a lute is partially these really long strings, but it's also a kind of wacky tuning. And the tuning happened because they tried to take a bass instrument and tune it like an alto instrument. If you tried to put like take your cello and tune it a lot higher, you would run into the same sort of problems that they did with the theorbo. So theorbos and lutes are tuned like viols, a bit like the guitar, fourths with 1/3 in it. And what should have been tuned like that, it's too high for a string of any diameter to make it to this length. So they just decided to take the top 2 strings and put them down the octave. And this was just a solution to try to get the instrument to be brighter at first, and maybe to accompany tenors. And it turned out to be a real advantage because I can instead play scales like without really moving my left hand very much. I can play across the strings, what they call campanella. And it allows me to play over this big length, but without really taxing myself too much. The long strings are to get low notes. If you think about the grand piano, or you think about any bass string, to get a really low string, you need a string with a lot of mass. And with the strings I had at the time, a long, thin string sounded a lot better than a short, thick string. So I've got a whole octave of bass strings here. And I only play them with the thumb of my right hand, so you'll never see me stretching up there except to tune. And so that's basically the theorbo. You may have some questions? No? Pretty straightforward? All right. I'll mention the other instrument. The Baroque guitar is kind of the inverted cousin of the theorbo. The theorbo, which has no proper singing string, high string. This instrument has no proper bass. So it shares that odd tuning of like how the theorbo went up and then down and up again. That's called the reentrant, also a feature of ukuleles and banjos. This instrument also is kind of all over the place with that. But that allows me to basically play chords that are almost always above the bass line, and so I don't have to worry about inversions. So it makes it very convenient. This Baroque guitar, this particular one is modeled on a 1770 instrument, but it stayed in this configuration for basically 2 centuries with 5 doubled courses, and the tuning E, B, G, D, A is identifiable to any modern guitarist. Both of the instruments have tied gut frets, and that allows me to adjust the tuning to most of the most common tuning system at the time. We're using one that's called 6-comma mean tone. That's like almost pure thirds. And maybe, actually, Avi, you want to play us some pretty chords and some not pretty chords?
So the idea with the temperament is that it turns out that if you really calculate it correctly with the right overtones, that that flats that there is no such thing as enharmonics. That a B flat does not equal an A sharp, and so on. So that would be B flat. That's an A sharp, and you hear that it's not the prettiest thing. It's a rather high, and that's a little more stable. And so at some point you have to decide which one you're going to get. What they decided within the last 100 years or so, it's at least on the piano, is that they would rather have everything work out, and they didn't care that anything was out of tune as long as it was all out of tune the same way. And so they divided up this little weirdness equally, so every half step is exactly the same, and therefore everything is equally in tune and equally out of tune. What we might call 12th comma mean tone, if you're to be correct. And so half steps in here, if you can hear it, it's a little easier to hear on an organ, but if you want to, half steps aren't all the same. Just a slight difference between each one. And it means that some chords are more in tune because the thirds are pure, and some chords are less in tune because the thirds are less pure.
And composers use that.
Yes, and so the idea is that you can play keys that are more pure sound better, and you write pieces in them for things that are more calm. And if you want to write in a key that has a lot of energy to it, a certain amount of anger, then you might write in a key with more accidentals, where the accidentals might not necessarily be the right ones.
What are you playing, Avi?
You might know this instrument. In fact, you might know this instrument specifically because this one belongs to the school. This is a lovely harpsichord. This is kind of the kind of instrument you might have seen in France in the 1730s or so. Although this one was built in 1979. And it is in a sense a mechanical version of what Dan is playing. And so the best way to describe it is that if you took it, it's lying on its side, and if you just lifted it up this way, it would just be a big harp. And you've got all the strings, and instead of the fingers plucking the strings, I've got a mechanism where if I depress the keys, I've got a little bit of quill, a little fingernail in there, that then plucks the string. And so I've got a machine, in a sense, to do what Dan does with his fingers. So obviously it's got a keyboard in the same way that a piano does, so does that instrument up there, which existed back in the time. So the interface is kind of the same as a piano, but instead of it being a percussion instrument that hits it, it's a plucking instrument. So it's really just a mechanical harp or a mechanical guitar, depending on how you want to say that. This one has two keyboards. That is somewhat common. That's on the larger side. You could have instruments with one keyboard, instruments with two keyboards. I think there might be a harpsichord or two with three keyboards, but that's really rare. Organs are the same story. You could have organs with a single keyboard, or up to, I think about 5 is probably as big as they ever got back in the day. And probably 5 is about as big as they get today. There are some with more, but it's a little extravagant. But they just allow you to have slightly different sounds. So I can have one set of strings plucking down here, and then a second one. And you hear they have a slightly different character to them. And then I can mechanically combine the two, and I get a little more punchy sound by combining the two together.
And the strings are?
Metal. Yeah, strings are made out of metal.
It's interesting that for string players, that they knew about how to make wrapped strings, how to make what we use today, but they only used them for the lowest strings of the violin or of the cello or the viola. They really, really liked the sound of just plain gut, and that really continued until into the 20th century. It's very late that metal strings really evolve as and we have records of people like Casals saying, just for the record, I really prefer playing on gut than on these nasty metal strings they have today. So this is actually in some ways this is definitely the same kind of instrument that 19th century players would have had as well in terms of the gut reaction against the strings. And for those string players out there, it really is a very different sensation to engage with a plain gut string than with a metal string. It's just a totally different, it asks for different articulation, it asks for a different amount of weight of bow stroke. So again, the strings can really teach you a lot as well. So those are our strings. Do you want to, and meanwhile, in the wind department.
So this you'll recognize as the trombone. It's what the Italians and Spanish call this instrument. The French and English had a different name for it that you might have heard, the sac-butt. The sac-butt comes from two old French verbs, which means they're fencing terms actually, to thrust and retreat. Sac-butter, which was the sac-butte, which was anglicized to sac-butt. So we're basically the thrust-retreat, which is how you change the pitch of the instrument. The trombone is actually one of the oldest instruments in the orchestra. It had this shape with the dual slide around 1475. Definitely by 1500 it was this way, and it was the bass instrument for the loud wind ensembles. But they found that because it was a versatile instrument, it could play soft and loud, that it was often used to accompany voices as well, or play vocal parts to kind of beef up the choirs at the time. They're often found in families or consorts, so you could have, this is a tenor size, exactly the same like a modern tenor trombone. There's an alto size, there's a bass size as well, even a contrabass at the time. And trombones were generally consort instruments that they were filling out bottom parts of ensembles, alto, tenor, bass lines. By the time we get to this kind of later, mid to late 17th century ensemble, you see that we're winnowed down to just one instrument, one trombone playing with the rest of the ensemble, and it's far more virtuosic music, and we're kind of one of the ensemble here rather than kind of a group of trombones together. And this is to kind of match and be imitative to the lines that are going on in the violins. A lot of this music was all about experimentation, and much of our repertoire is today, actually, quite a few numbers are for one violin and one cornetto and one trombone and one dulcian, which you'll hear about in a second. And it's kind of pairing kind of different sound qualities of different instruments and pairing them together, or twos and threes and fours to make as much difference as possible. I mean, these pieces you'll hear that we're going from a slow to a fast, from a duple to a triple, but it's also in the tone color as well, that the violin is the melody with the dulcian, and then it'll be a cornetto with the trombone, and then the violin, a cornetto with the trombone, and then all four of us together. So it's all about as much variety as possible in one 6-minute little sonata.
And so you probably guess this instrument is the ancestor of the bassoon. And Greg called it the dulcian. That was one of its names. It had a lot of names. In Italy, it would be called the fagotto, and in Germany, which is what they call the bassoon today. In Spain, they called it bajon, and in France, basson, which is also the modern words. And in England, and the English word for it actually is kirtle. And that comes from the word, when you think of the word curtail, it means to shorten, right? So it's a big long tube that was bent back on itself, so it's shortened. So we have it essentially an 8-foot instrument, but in a little 4-foot package. So that's, it was used, it was very portable, and therefore a good outdoor instrument. The wind instruments often were employed playing outside in town bands and things like this, and so this was common bass instrument. And it also, like the trombone, came in a consort. So this is the bass version, and there are 3 sizes higher: soprano, alto, and tenor, and they're actually, believe it or not, at least 3 sizes larger than this one. And Germans in particular really like the big ones. And it only has 2 keys, this one here and one on the back, and they are only for reach, not for chromaticism. So if you're on any modern woodwind, most of the keys are to even out the scale and get all the chromatic notes easily, but this doesn't have any of that. It's more like a recorder in the fingerings you have to use. So a lot of fork fingerings, a lot of odd things to get, and we also don't play in really remote keys. There are no early Baroque pieces in F sharp minor or C sharp, thank God. And we just wouldn't be able to do it. And yeah, any questions about our instruments? Yeah?
I have a question about the orbo. You said that it's kind of like acapella. How much thumb muting would you be doing for the bass lines, or was it practice to let them bring over?
The long bass, the long gut strings, they can ring for a while, but it's not quite that snarly way that modern, like guitar strings and such, ring. If I need to articulate something like that, I will mute, but in general, I don't do a lot of it. Like if I need to, maybe I'll do a little touch like that.
For the sackbut, what key is it in?
It's in B flat. Well, that's a good question. We're playing at a 440, but we're used to orchestral pitch, and this is a B flat trombone, just like a modern B flat tenor. If you look in treatises from the early 17th century, it says the trombone is an A, And the question about that is that all the existing instruments are exactly this size. And so we know that they actually played early on, and we have organs that are this pitch a half step higher than we're playing now. So the trombone in A is at 466 instead of 440.
So your A is, that would be your A.
All right, so let's open up this Pandora's box. So some of you might have heard that historical pitch is not what we do now. And that is true, but what we do now is not standardized either. For example, in New York, you might, so A440 is your standard pitch, right? Well, no, in New York, current standard pitch is A441. I think the Met is at 442 currently. And I've heard stories that some Russian orchestras are up at 446 even. So even pitch being a standard now is not exactly true. Now, why can pitch vary? Because pitch is only one more thing that we can measure. It actually, I didn't think about it until recently. I read an article a few years ago. They were talking about how they were on the International Committee of Weights and Measures had decided to figure out exactly what a gram is. Again, you would think we would know what a gram is, but apparently there is a piece of metal that weighs a gram, and there are several copies of it around the world. And every so few years, they all get together and make sure that we're all really knowing what a gram is. Because if you multiply a gram, or whatever this unit of measurement is, by thousands, it actually ends up making a difference. In the same way that 440 and 441 actually is a thing. So somebody has to sit down and say, we are in kilos instead of pounds, or that a kilo is exactly this and not that, or that we are in meters as opposed to inches, and that a meter is this and not that. So, or they just apparently standardized that a second is so many oscillations of a quartz crystal, but not slightly different number of oscillations of a quartz crystal that we thought it was before, because you're always trying to do this. Now, if you go back to the 17th or 18th century, Europe is a much more fragmented place than it is even today, politics aside, or in fact, politics are exactly what the issue is. So if you're going to say that a meter is this, somebody has to decide what that is, and that person has to have power, or that institution has to have power over the rest of the people around it to say that this is what it is. And do you think France is going to let England tell it what to do? Or do you think the Duke of this thing is going to let the Duke of that tell them what to do? And so you really run into issues where their pitch can be all over the place. If you're in this town, pitch is here, and if you're at that town, pitch is there. But when we try and perform this music, something having to do with the correct pitch, then we try and make bigger generalizations and say, okay, so pitch in Germany in the 17th century would have been on the high side, let's say 440 or 460 something around there, and then pitch in France later on would have been much lower, and so now we quantify it to half steps. So let's say 440 is modern standard pitch, which we all know it is not. Then we go a little bit flat from that. We'll go down a half step, A415. You want to go really flat, you go down a whole step, A392. You want to go higher up by a half step, and you get A466. The truth is, none of those pitches were actually real. It was somewhere along those lines. So if you remember your high school chemistry class with the electron shells, anyone remember that? Oh, come on, really? That the electrons don't actually live there, but they're sort of around there, and we quantify them to be at all those pitches. And this is not just for Baroque music. There's a very famous story of pitch rising and rising in the 19th century, so much so that Verdi is complaining that now his operas are being performed at higher pitches than what he wrote them at, and the singers are now singing in ranges that he never intended. And of course, he knew how he wanted his singers to sound, and if a tenor has to squeeze out what would have been a G but is now in a B flat or something, then it doesn't sound at all like how they meant it to sound. And so it seems that the idea of 440 as any sort of standard is a result of the BBC in 1939. That their idea of A was, the BBC's idea of A was 440, and therefore, because radio is a mass is a mass medium, that had rule over a larger bit of geography, whereas before everybody could decide their own little things.
I think we have just time for pieces after 5 minutes. Can we play a piece and ask for a couple more questions? Right. So this is going to be the full version of, you heard a little bit of this duo that happens in the middle of this Castello Sonata, and this is now the full sonata. So this is a collection that was published around 1629. The weird thing about the composer, this guy Dario Castello, we know nothing about him. We don't know when he was born, we don't know when he died. We think that he probably knew Monteverdi based on some evidence in the music. And all we know is this music, which is really cool. And in the preface to this collection, he says, you might want to try these pieces over once or twice before you perform them. So it's interesting to, it's like one very rare moment that, oh, actually people did rehearse. Sometimes, with some repertoire.
Thank